Well, investors, of course, have been digesting earnings in the US as well and the prospect of further cuts from the Fed. So what is the corporate outlook for the US on the year ahead, and where are the opportunities? CEO of Trobe Financial, Chris Andrews, joins me now. Chris, a lot of people very bullish about 2025. Where do you sit at Trobe?
We're very bullish too, Juliette. I've travelled widely in the US over the last few months, and I can tell you in the lead up to the US election, first there was a bit of nervousness because it wasn't a conventional election, as we all know and has been widely covered. But about a month before the election, you could just feel the US business community say they really snapped to, and they said, it's going to be a really strong pro-business environment. We're going to see deregulation. We're going to see lower taxes. And so the animal spirits in the US are well and truly out. Now, that says the next 12 months are going to be a really busy time in US markets. There'll be the headlines and there'll be the rises and the dips, of course, but it's going to be a really strong 12 months in the US. Looking longer term, we are very, very bullish on the US. We think the longer term, in fact, is better than over the next 12 months. Longer term, the US is absolutely going to be focused on rebuilding Middle America. That part was hollowed out through the 1990s and into the 2000s. And that, for investors, is a wonderful opportunity.
Is the opportunity across both, private, public markets? Where are you looking specifically?
Well, we like private markets, Juliette, not, the public markets. The story of the Magnificent Seven and the rise of the tech segment has been really, really well covered. And that's a wonderful story and will probably continue. What we like, though, in the private market is the ability to invest in those companies that are sitting around the Magnificent Seven. If I take an example, Intel at the moment is building a huge chip fab facility in Arizona. That's potentially a wonderful investment for Intel, although they're having troubles really nailing it just at the moment. But if you think of the network of companies that will sit around that fab, that will provide supplies, that will do the construction work, that will do the gardening, that will provide the uniforms, it's wonderful business for Middle America. And as progressively various parts of the US supply chain are reshored, it's those Middle American companies that will benefit. And by themselves already, Juliette, that's the third largest economy in the world. So it's an incredible opportunity for investors.
Indeed, but there are still obviously risks, and we've talked about whether or not there is going to be a repeat of the trade war that we saw during the COVID pandemic. What other sort of, wildcards or risks are you looking out for?
The two big risks are geopolitics, and it's, you might roll, trade wars potentially into that category, but it's hot wars first and foremost that anyone looking at the world today would be reflecting on. And the other risk, of course, is inflation. With so much stimulus, with the animal spirits out and about, we do all have to be very watchful of inflation, because as we saw through COVID, it doesn't take too much for the inflation genie to get out of the bottle again. So, I can tell you markets are very watchful on that. I can tell you that the US Fed will be very watchful on that. Certainly at the moment, markets generally are vacillating between dovish and hawkish sort of from week to week, month to month, depending on the headline. But those are the two biggest risks that I'd point to, Juliette.
And of course, what we learnt through COVID as well was the effects of supply chains and supply chain breakdowns. You mentioned there the concept of America First and bringing a lot of that back onshore to America. Where then would you avoid in areas that might be left out?
Look, Juliette, we're operating in a very big world, and the US, although it's a vast population, 350 million people, simply will be physically unable to bring all their supply chains back on shore. There's just not enough Americans. And as a consequence, there will be still wonderful opportunities for trade. What we as a nation here in Australia are very trade exposed. What we want and what we benefit from is a world where borders are open and there can be the really free exchange of goods. Right at the moment, what you're hearing out of the US, you can hear some worrying signals, but you could also say that some of the complaints that the US is making are not entirely without foundation. So our expectation in the end is that the world will find a rational middle spot. There will be reshoring for national security reasons, for supply chain security reasons, for everything that was well covered through COVID and in the more complex geopolitical situation that we're in. But we remain optimistic that global trade is not going away.
Does Australia remain, I guess, a little bit more buffered as well, given, firstly, we haven't been mentioned by the president in terms of any tariffs, and we know that we actually run a deficit with the US, but also hopefully it won't be put in a position where Australia has to choose between China or the US?
I don't expect that will be the case, Juliette. So we have had for many years really warm relationships both with the US and with China, albeit we've all seen the difficulties that have appeared from time to time in the Chinese relationship in particular. There's nothing to suggest the Australian relationship with the US will be in any difficulty. We've served with the US in essentially every conflict that they've been involved in over the last 100 years. Our soldiers have. And as you say, we're one of the few nations that's actually running at a trade deficit with the US. So on that metric, we'll certainly be in the good books. But also, taking the longer term view, there are really deeply entrenched relationships between Australia and America that will transcend any one or two or three presidencies or administrations or congresses. And that's the important thing. The cultural and the people-to-people connections will stand us in very good stead through whatever the world is going to throw at us over the next 10 years.
How are you viewing the disruption that we've seen by AI and how much we should be looking at that? Really shouldn't have probably caught us by surprise, but it did seem to, the DeepSeek shock, and how much businesses are now focusing on AI and I guess more competitive, cheaper versions.
So it's a fascinating story, isn't it? One way of putting it is the US stock market had a huge setback when they realised that NVIDIA chips were even more useful than what everyone had thought. I think that AI is a wonderful story for the world economy, for Australia, for the US generally, and the fact that China are continuing to develop their own capability in that area should be surprising to no one. Here in Australia, reflect on the fact that we now have productivity at the same level as what we had in 2016. We have a productivity crisis that we simply haven't been focused on enough, although, Australia's economists have been pointing this out for about 20 years. It is a really serious issue, and AI is one tool. It's not the complete answer, but it's one tool that could help us reignite our productivity as a nation, because in the end, that's what will drive our national wealth.
And is that the sort of point that everybody should be making, that we utilise AI to make our jobs easier rather than it's actually taking over jobs?
Juliette, the best analogy is to think about the invention of the machine. 200 years ago, if I was fit and strong, I might be able to plough a field in a day. Then they invented tractors and ploughs, and suddenly I could plough a whole farm in a day. Now, you might have thought that meant that all those people, 90% of the US population, for example, was employed on farms at the turn of the 20th century. That's now less than 1%. So where have all those jobs gone? They've gone into more productive, more value-adding jobs. I'm not saying there's no risks with AI, but I'm saying the hype sometimes is a little bit overblown. There are wonderful opportunities in AI, and as a nation and as a workforce, we should be really leaning in to grab hold of them. I'll say something else. If we put our head in the sand and if we say, too scary, we're not going to do it, we're not going to try, we're not going to experiment, we're not going to learn, we'll be left behind. It really is a competitive world that we're in, Juliette. And going back to what I was saying about productivity before, we can't as a nation take our continued prosperity for granted. It's really important we make the most of these opportunities.